All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Archaeology with Flint Dibble. I am here with a friend of the channel, Dr. Sarah Bond from the University of Iowa. And she is here to mostly talk about strikes and resistance and things like that. Here, wait a second. Here we go. So she just published a book, I guess, what was it, last month?
February 4th.
Wait, you're crackling up a little.
Oh, February 4th. Is that coming
Okay,
through
February
better?
4th.
Great.
Yeah, I don't know what that was. So yeah, February 4th, so okay, 2 months ago. It's a book called Strike, Labor Unions and Resistance in the Roman Empire. And we'll dive into that. I think there's nothing more timely. But I do want to just plug her a bit. She's a regular contributor to the art magazine Hyperallergic, and she writes awesome stuff there. And she also once appeared on Full Frontal with Samantha Bee. And so I am personally jealous of that because that's awesome. Talk about public engagement with history and classics and stuff like that, and art history in this case. It was a special on whiteness and statues and white at the museum. And check it out. It's on YouTube. It's free to watch. I recommend everybody check it out. And then she's also the editor of the Past Imperfect newsletter, which I wanted to drop. Well, okay, wait. First, I'm going to drop the link for the book in the chat. This is for the book from Yale University Press. And then this is the link to the Substack for Past Imperfect. And yeah, you publish that weekly, right, Sarah?
We go every 2 weeks. So we have,
Every 2 weeks.
yeah, every 2 weeks or so. We used to go every week, but it is quite intensive at this point. So, yeah.
And she's regularly highlighting in there all sorts of different contributions from the field of classics and ancient history and archaeology. And so it's a really good summary of, as well as good essays that sometimes are by guest contributors and yourself. So it's a combo of different things. They're really good. So check
Yeah,
out the Substack.
one of the things that we really want to do is to exactly what you're doing, Flint, which is to give people a lot of open access to a lot of the journals and books that people are writing that may not always require library access, that they can get for free, that they can read on the web, that they don't necessarily have to be academics in order to read these things and to process them. So a lot of the links and a lot of the articles that we summarize or the essays that we have are meant to be read by regular people to bring academia together with people who are just interested in the ancient world.
Exactly. I think it's a fantastic venture to try to make this stuff accessible and interesting and engaging, which I think is the goal here, right?
Yeah.
And so when you think of, I was thinking about your book. I mean, I've read through most of it now. I think it's fantastic. But B, I think it's good because it really challenges this conventional picture of the Roman world that people have, which is kind of like the view from the elites, the emperors and things like that. This is what shows up and people think of when we think of ancient Rome is the extravagance of these assholes, if you will. And so, you seem to take a very subaltern approach of from the bottom up. Is that kind of what got you motivated to write this book?
Yeah, I think that I've always looked at things kind of from below. I started a blog many years ago called History from Below. But when I started doing my dissertation at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, it was on disreputable professionals in the Roman world. So we're talking about funeral workers, we're talking about tanners, we're talking about fullers and bakers and professionals who did a lot of manual labor, and manual labor is not seen in a very good light by elites. And so I'd been writing about that since about 2007. So I've always been looking at just what we might call blue collar workers since I got to grad school. And I guess it took until about graduation until I looked back and thought to myself, I am just writing about my background. I am just writing about the fact that I am from Appalachia. I am not from kind of the traditional background of classics. My parents did not complete college. My dad was a Vietnam veteran and was a helicopter pilot. And so I didn't have the traditional route to classics that a lot of people do. And so I think I got into history from below because, as we find out oftentimes when we write about things about the past, we're exploring a lot of the anxieties and ideas or things that we're familiar with about our own background.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that, when you think about the study of the classical world, for so long it was done by wealthy people, and so the elites, if you will, and so they focused on the elites in the past, the monuments and the emperors and things like that. And as we've seen higher education become more accessible, especially in the late 20th century, maybe a little less so today in some ways, but especially in the late 20th century, what that led to is people of our generation coming in from different backgrounds and therefore bringing different questions and interests and stuff like that to the study of the ancient world. And so, yeah, you're a great example of that, I think.
I think it's
Um,
all about what questions you want to ask. Like there was a new study that just came out yesterday about Heinrich Schliemann's assertions about wine at Troy, right? And he believed that mostly it's just elites like Priam and Hecuba who are drinking wine at Troy. But then the recent analyses of the ceramics that they've been finding at Troy have found that regular people are also drinking wine. But Schliemann, he's coming from a very elite background and he wants to see wine as a very ritual, very wealthy drink that is only drunk by the people of the Iliad at the very top tier. Because that's what Schliemann is interested in, and those are the only people that he's interested in seeing and being visible. And so,
mhm.
when we are only interrogating one group of people, we only see one group of people. And so, I think a big part of this book is about seeing the people that really are there, but that are not usually in the narratives of people like Tacitus or Ammianus Marcellinus or Dio Cassius or many of the other historians that we have, but still saying that we're able to recover their lives. It's just a little bit more difficult than, say, straightforward narratives of the historians of ancient Rome.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I mean, as an archaeologist who studies, humble animal bones, as I've had some hoity-toity professors say, that's exactly the goal for me as well, is to move away from this focus on sort of hoity-toity art, right, and monuments and stuff like that, and try to look at what everyday people were doing. And so, yeah, I think that's a really important thing, that we need to repopulate the past with just everybody that was there, not just these rich assholes, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Another thing though that I think people are familiar with though, besides there's always those fun stories though of wait a second, wait for it to load, of resistance. And so I think that this is key also because not only do you have everyday people in your story, your narrative, your book, well, I don't know, whatever. Yeah, your story. Story doesn't sound right. I don't
Well,
know.
I think we always think of narratives as being fictional, but I also think it's very important to say that narratives of nonfiction are something that bring audiences in, and that's what we're trying to do. Is we're trying to widen, to broaden our readership, and so it's okay to call it a story because all narratives are synthetic. It's just we're trying to bring people into a story of different people that we haven't heard before.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I think, and you even discussed this very openly in your introduction about the difficulty of applying modern concepts of like labor unions and labor associations to the ancient Roman world. But of course, we have really clear examples from the ancient Roman world, which we can get into. But like the one that everybody knows about is Spartacus, right? Where
Yeah.
these enslaved people, they united and rose up and tried to fight back, I guess, a little bit. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, what do you think about applying these kind of modern concepts? What can we see about labor unions in the ancient world?
Well, I should lay out a little bit and say that Spartacus really is a rebellion. So this
Yeah.
is not an example of a strike or of a withholding of labor in a sense that they would go back to their jobs. And so one of the things that I try and show in the book, especially with the Spartacus chapter, is that rebellion and resistance can take different types, can take different approaches. And with Spartacus, the rebellion is to be free of slavery altogether. And so their chief objective is not to go back to work. When they actually escape from the gladiatorial school, they are wanting to leave. And so when they decide to go north towards the Alps, what I always say when my students are reading about Spartacus is I always want him to continue and then go over the Alps, but instead he decides to turn and then come back south again. And I'm like, no, 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 don't turn, because then things start really going badly there forward. But Spartacus, by the time that he is defeated, there is about 100,000 people that he has gathered with his rebellion. But at the very beginning of it, it really starts with a familia of gladiators, and a familia are enslaved persons are called a familia, even though that's where we get the modern word family from. And they are within this gladiatorial school, and a familia or a number of familiae are normally owned by very wealthy Romans. So Caesar has many hundreds of familiae of gladiators that he has at his gladiatorial schools, and Spartacus is at a gladiatorial school as well, and he's held within a cell in his familia, and his familia is very close knit, and they run into the kitchen and they use knives and utensils, etc., in order to start the rebellion. So I think it's very important to see that this is not about a chaotic plan that just happened to be successful. That one of the things about labor organization and why it becomes successful is that there is an underlying superstructure that we have to anatomize and see. And one of those things is that the familia is a building block outwards to see how rebellions happen, but also to see how other types of work stoppages and other types of labor upheavals work as well. So we have a lot of other examples within the Roman world that are in the book that also talk about things like boycotts, about
Hmm.
strikes, about uprisings. And so Spartacus is a rebellion, and he wants to get completely free along with the enslaved persons that he inspires to never come back to work. But many thousands of other people within the Roman world, like their peers who engage in rebellion, simply want to leverage this rebellion into better working conditions, into better wages, into better environments, and as a way of getting members of their various unions, which are called factions, or sometimes they're called collegia, theasoi, various other names for these groups within the ancient world. They're trying to get things like their members freed from prison, right? They're trying to get various things, but they're not necessarily trying to be free of work altogether. So
Yeah.
there's a spectrum of how people are using these tactics of labor stoppages, and Spartacus is at this end of the spectrum over here, which is like, fuck you, I'm never coming back to work. And then we have this end of the spectrum, which is like, okay, maybe I'll stop for a few hours and sit in the back of the temple, which is like common in Ptolemaic Egypt, where it's like, okay, we're just walking off the job here for a few hours, like an Italian at a train station or something who decides to go on strike for 5 hours while they eat lunch. That's over here on this side of the spectrum. And then over here is Spartacus, where he's like, I'm totally out forever.
Which I
So,
think
yeah.
also makes a difference due to the status in a different way, because enslaved people, that's going to be very different than free or freed people who are employed, let's say, who want to work for the wages, while enslaved people are more interested in their freedom in a sense. So I think that makes a
Yeah.
lot of sense.
Well, also
Um,
because we want to think about their corporal vulnerability, because the big thing is when enslaved persons go back to work, they will be very vulnerable to being beaten and to being
mhm.
perhaps even killed if they are not highly skilled, or if they are not considered to be extremely valuable to the enslaver. And so if the individuals are brought back into captivity after being, after fleeing, they may be whipped, they may be maimed, they may have branding put on their skin. And so, of course, if you're enslaved, oftentimes you want to completely free yourself. But we have many examples of enslaved persons who are so professionalized and so skilled that they avoid being perhaps as corporally vulnerable because they are extremely valuable for their artisanal abilities. Yeah.
I mean, heck, we have people that were historians, for example. We have people that were artists and goldsmiths and whatnot, and very wealthy enslaved people under the emperors and things like that. So
Yeah, the Familia
yeah.
Caesaris is a very important example. Going back to that word familia again, these are enslaved persons, but you can be extremely wealthy as part of the Familia Caesaris, all the way down to the lowest level individual, and still be what we would consider a slave.
So did enslaved people at times have acts of maybe not work stoppage, but to slow down work as a sort of a hidden act of rebellion, if you see what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to see that just because you have enslaved persons within a society doesn't mean that you can't have everyday acts of resistance. And we're seeing that people are engaging in these acts today, exactly, slowing down the times of production, um, kind of mucking up the supply chain a little bit and things like this. But you have, for instance, in the second century, a number of petitions from individuals who are only quasi free. They're called coloni. It's where we get the word colonate or colonialism. And these are essentially peasants who are farmers, but they're only kind of quasi free. They're not enslaved, but they're not quite free. And they have to live on these agricultural estates in North Africa. And they petition to the emperor, to Commodus, who we have already, remember, talked about. And they petition and they say, if we aren't treated better on the imperial estates, we're going to get out of here. So they're leveraging the fact that they're organizing collectively. And they say, we're going to leave collectively from these estates. And then who will bring in all of the crops when it is time? And so they petition and they are listened to time and time again, because who is going to reap the fields? Is Commodus going to go out there and do it? Is he going to beat all 500 of these coloni? And so I think it's just proof that no matter the status, if people come together and work together and know the value of their labor, that they can leverage it in different ways. Is it always successful? No. And I think Spartacus is a good example of that. I mean, at the very end of the Spartacan rebellion from 73 to 71, you've got thousands killed on the Via Appia through crucifixion. I mean, clearly it's not always successful, but we have people who collectively act and that they know their worth and that are much more successful in the ancient world than Spartacus was. Spartacus is just the most dramatic and largest of the upheavals. Yeah.
Let's get a good example then. We live in these times
Okay.
where we need some joy. So tell us about how some collective action actually sparked something good for people in the past.
Okay, so my favorite example we should start with is probably the first strike, because I
Mhm.
feel like we want to talk about strikes in general, and I just want to say that I am aware that the word strike is not an ancient word. Okay, so we're just gonna say I know that the word was coined in 1768 by British sailors. Okay, I've done the background. I know that work stoppages go by many names, and what I am proposing to you is much like Shakespeare. A rose by any other name, a work stoppage by any other name is still just as sweet of a method. Okay. And so I think part of what this book is proposing is that we can have a sustained anachronism and call something a strike because the methods are clearly the same in antiquity as they are very analogous to the same ones today. And so I think breaking down the semantic barriers, these language barriers, really help us make comparisons between the past and the present. And to make academics really get over themselves a little bit about how particular we are, that we can still have nuance, but say, let's call a spade here, okay? Because we want to see that these tactics have relevance over the longue durée, okay? And we can do these longue durée studies and they show us these methods are effective over time. And so the first strike that we know of is probably around 1157 or 1155 in the worker village of Deir el Medina. And we have the actual papyrus for it. I think it's on slide 12 in the PowerPoint that I gave you. But Deir el-Medina is a worker village in Egypt, and so the workers are very upset with the fact that Ramesses the third has been withholding emmer and wheat from them. And so they decide that they are going to go sit in the back of various temples. There's 3 different temples that they go sit in the back of. And they just say, until you pay us in our emmer and our wheat, because coinage has not yet been invented as a technology, that they're going to go sit in the back of the temple and they're just going to do nonviolent chilling until they're going to engage in nonviolent tactics until they are paid what they deserve. And part of this that's very important to understand is that in the ancient world, as well as in the early medieval world, there was this idea with temples that there was a cilia. And asilia is where we get the word asylum from. And within the medieval world, there's also something you guys are probably much more familiar with, which is called sanctuary. Okay? And sacred spaces, no violence is supposed to happen in a sacred temenos, within a space of sacredness. And this goes in Egypt as well as in Greece, as well as in Rome. And so I think these workers, what they're really saying is, you cannot have violence within a temple space. So we have sat in the back of the temple. You cannot drag us out. You cannot remove us from the temple. So we're just going to chill here till we get our emmer, and we are going to collectively bargain. And we aren't going to go back to work in the worker village until we have our terms and agreements and our contract renegotiated. So obviously, I'm using a lot of modern terms that are able to be understood, but I think that the Turin Strike Papyrus gives us a lot of insight into the way that worker contracts are negotiated. And these are free workers. These are not enslaved workers. The predominantly free workers are working at Deir el-Medina, just like free workers are predominantly the ones that built the pyramids. So, keep that in mind. But they are our first example that we know of that there was a strike. And so this really sets the tone, especially in Egypt, because Egypt has the most examples of labor strikes in the ancient world. It's just the highest number that we have are in really Ptolemaic Egypt is the highest number, where it's called anakaresis, which is a withdrawal. And then Ptolemaic Egypt is really where it's perfected. But then it goes into Roman Egypt as well, where they're just like, we're out. You're going to go sit in the back of the
it
temple.
makes sense. I think given the quality of historical textual evidence we have from Egypt, that's where we'd expect to find that kind of stuff. You talk a lot about you talk about the various different biases in our textual record, including that, something like 4% of all sources exist that we have today, from the past. And then on top of it, of course, the biases in who writes down this stuff means that you very rarely get descriptions of these kind of strikes, if you will. But at the same time, in Egypt, part of what we have is so much documentary evidence. And it's because of that documentary evidence rather than literary evidence that I imagine we get so much of that stuff from Egypt, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. Definitely the survival record is not even. And anybody who studies the ancient world knows that Egypt is outsized in the amount of evidence that we have from it. And so the continuing argument continues to be among people who study the Roman Empire, is Egypt anomalous? Is it an outlier? Or do we simply just have more evidence from Egypt than anywhere else? And I tend to think that Egypt is a wealthier province, and Walter Scheidel has certainly shown this in a lot of the wealth inequality studies that he's done, but it's very comparable to Italy in terms of the amount of wealth that we have, as well as North Africa. And so I really think it's just about survival rate. It's not that Egypt is all that different from the rest of the Roman Empire. It's simply that it has a very arid climate, and the writing habits are much higher because papyrus is readily available. So
yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So okay, let's bring us down to Rome.
Okay. I will bring it down to Rome. So okay. All right. So probably the most famous, and if we go to, I think, 14, yeah. The most famous that we can probably talk about and that you guys are familiar with are the secessions of the plebeians. And so I think one big question that you might want to ask is, how are the secessions of the plebs a labor strike? Like, how does that qualify as such? And I will tell you that we have these two groups within ancient Rome called the plebeians and the patricians. Okay, the patres are the original families of Rome, and in America we might say that these are the people that came over on the Mayflower. These are like the original people of Rome in 753 who are enrolled in the Senate, and Romulus decides that these are the patricians of Rome. Now, everybody else are the plebeians, and the plebeians go from extremely wealthy people all the way down to extremely impoverished people, even though we use the word plebeian to be kind of like just shorthand for poor people. We think plebes is just poor people, but actually there were very wealthy plebeians all the way down. In any case, in the year 495 BCE, we're told by Livy, and of course, a lot of early Rome is a mix of myth as well as history. But Livy says that there is a lot of debt because every single year the patricians are asking the plebeians to enroll in the military levy. In other words, if we think about America in the 1970s, imagine every single year America is requiring young men to go into the military every single year, right? And so, and I say young men because Romans only take men in the military, okay? And so we have every single year an increase in the military levy being required for these plebeians. And the plebeians are like, we're not the generals. We are not allowed to hold any magistracies or be any of the major religious organizers. And so why are we having to serve in the military every single year? And also the artisans and the farmers have to leave the fields and they have to leave their workshops in order to serve in the military. Okay, and so they go into debt because they aren't there to bring in the crops and they aren't there to make their pottery and they aren't there to create weapons and things like this that they would normally sell for a profit. So they go into deep debt bondage. And we know that in 495, a veteran comes into the forum and he shows that one of his debt enslavers has beaten him with a whip, and he's a veteran. And people go up in arms and they decide that they are going to withdraw from the city in a secession. And that means that they are refusing to enroll in the military levy. And we have between 3 and 5 of these secessions that go all the way until 286. So this is about a little over 200 years that we call the struggle of the orders. And during that period, the plebeians are in a constant kind of back and forth, where sometimes they leave to go to the Aventine Hills, sometimes they leave to go to the Janiculum, sometimes they go to a place called the Mons Sacra. But a portion of them or all of them are receding from the city and they are refusing to be a part of the military. And whatever you think, the military is work, okay, guys? The military is labor. And so they are refusing to give their labor to what is asked of them. And so they are sitting just like these Egyptians in the back of the temple. They're just sitting on a hill and refusing to work. So I think the secession of the plebs is probably the most famous, and that's why Karl Marx, believed that the secession of the plebs was the most famous class war and the most famous example of a strike ever to have existed. So yes, there's Marx and Engels believed.
So you're trying to teach everybody here some communism, aren't you?
I am not. I did wear red today, but I didn't know it. I think it's important to say that ancient historians today are aware that the plebeians do not form what we would call a Marxist class because they are not aware of what a social class is, but because, as I said before, the plebeians actually are socioeconomically not homogenous. They are a heterogeneous group because socioeconomically they're all over. So Marx didn't have it 100% right. Yeah.
This is something I find difficult to explain to students as well, where these divisions are not just based on wealth, they're based on status, which is sort of like, who your family is and things like that. And that's why you can have some patricians that are extremely impoverished. and you can have plebeians that are extremely wealthy. And as we discussed, you can have enslaved people that are
Mhm.
extremely wealthy, despite all these divisions of status in
Mhm.
Roman society. And so, yeah, important to get
Yeah.
across.
Yeah. But I mean, there are other examples going into the Roman imperial period, especially, and I won't list like every single one of them, but I will just say that collegia increasingly into the imperial period are seen as kind of very troublesome. And so in Roman law, especially, you begin to see more and more legislation that's calling out collegia not being able to meet at night, collegia only being able to meet once a month, disbanding of collegia if they are
So,
seen as
wait a second.
troublesome.
Let's introduce for
Hmm.
everybody what collegia are.
Hmm.
I always kind of like this scene from Monty Python,
Oh, yes.
and Life of Brian, where it's like, oh, it's going slow. What's so special about the cheesemakers type thing? And so these are basically associations of people that share similar jobs, let's say. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a collegium in the singular can be any club or group. You should
Okay.
just think of a collegium as a social group. And so this could be the Elks Club, it could be at the VFW, it could be a ladies' gardening group. It could be a group that worships Bacchus, for instance, is called a collegium. But also, oftentimes, it can be groups of artisans that share a trade, carpenters, silversmiths, metal workers, people who share a common ability to do something form collegia oftentimes together, and they cluster together just like you would see in a town like Pittsburgh, or just like you would see at Liverpool or Manchester, that certain trades cluster together like sailors at a port.
Hmm.
That you have shipwrights together with carpenters, together with various other tradespeople that work together. So collegia need to be able to function together for the supply chain to work correctly within the Roman economic system of the Mediterranean. And so collegia are oftentimes extremely necessary to get supplies, to get grain that is shipped from Alexandria to Constantinople or to Rome. But at times, collegia also can be very politically active. And so that is where the trouble comes in, that people like Julius Caesar and people like Augustus and many times other emperors going into the imperial period pass legislation because they get a lot of anxiety about collegia forcing issues within the political sphere, especially Julius Caesar. But then it kind of cascades after that to a fear of associations in general. And we have to kind of ask ourselves then, is that evidence that collegia had clout within certain areas of the Roman Empire, and that unions, if we want to call collegia as sometimes acting like a union in order to advocate for their members, that perhaps these unions are doing something that is very similar to what unions do today, and that emperors are doing something that we might call union busting.
Yeah, and I mean, if you ever go visit Pompeii and you read some Latin, you can walk around and go check out the graffiti, and it's like the bakers urge you to vote for Priscus or whatever. And so Panza, that's what it is. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I got a plug for everybody. Tomorrow or Sunday, probably tomorrow, we're releasing our first video on Pompeii, and it's going to be an awesome one. And part of it's in the house of Panza. Speaking of which, so yeah, but it's actually a whole lot of electoral graffiti are from different collegia, different groups of artisans, and clearly they have some sort of impact on these local elections,
Mm-hmm.
or else they wouldn't be doing it.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I mean,
yeah.
we can't think that we're all that different today than from antiquity. I mean, there are definitely differences that we can expound upon, and I don't want to say that there's a 1-to-1 ratio at all. But what I'm saying is, we can't think that artisans and craftspeople are just mutually exclusive from the political sphere. That you have politicians over here and artisans over here, and never the two shall meet. We know that there's a Venn diagram, just like there is today, in the same way that Trump supported a lot of the Teamsters, a lot of the various unions. And remember that the unions, at least in the election here in 2024, refused, O'Neill did, at least the head of the Teamsters, to even declare for either Trump or for Kamala Harris because they were afraid of getting it wrong. Because they didn't know who was going to be president, and so they didn't even want to call it because they were scared to back any politician. But normally, unions back a certain presidential candidate, and that has been the thing since the early 20th century with unions.
Mhm.
But I mean, unions being a part of politics is not just part of the 20th century. This is something that goes way back in time, so that aediles, that are the market overseers in the Roman world, they're constantly being bought off and kind of wooed by collegia. Like, oh, could you lower the price of fish? Could you lower, the tariffs? Could you lower the tax rate, etc.? It's just like today in terms of corruption and in terms of the fact that you want a politician that's going to be in your corner.
The political machine is and was real.
Yeah.
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 Okay, if they're union busting, then these unions are having impacts potentially on elections, but they're also doing things like potentially rioting and striking. What's some other examples of some collective action that you have?
Well, I think the most famous one that we have to kind of work backwards from and ask ourselves whether collegia were a part of it is the very famous uprising that we have in Pompeii. So I think you have is the depiction in there? I'm not sure. We can pull it up if not, and I will find another picture of the riot of Pompeii. But in 59 CE,
Yeah.
there is a huge riot that happens in the amphitheater at Pompeii, and we have a beautiful fresco that is in the book, and I talk a lot about it. But after this huge riot that happens, that the collegia are apparently a part of it, all collegia in Pompeii are supposed to be disbanded for 10 years. And that really tells us that not only are the collegia involved in the sports scene, which is very much what we know collegia are a part of, that they have little sections just like unions do today. Like if you go to a Pittsburgh Steelers game in the United States, for instance, or if you went to any kind of football game in the UK, you would see that they have box seats that are specifically for certain groups. So we know that collegia have their own areas, but that why else would these collegia have been disbanded after this unless they are more closely being associated with violence and uprisings more and more into the imperial period? And so, this is a very famous example of the freedom of assembly, we might say, being done away with. A lot of the civil rights say that we enjoy today, the freedom of protest, the freedom of association, being suspended within the ancient world for a period of 10 years, and collegia being suspended for 10 years because of the violence that is happening. Now, in Italy, when there are soccer riots, normally they have to play in an empty soccer stadium.
Yeah.
Like you
Here,
have to.
so wait, also, just so people know, these are not gladiatorial fighters here. This is a big brawl between, I think was it Nola or
Nuceria.
Nuceria?
It's
Nuceria.
Nuceria.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. So citizens, so people from Nuceria and from Pompeii, and just brawling at it, and it led to all these repercussions in Pompeii, shutting down the games, shutting down the collegia and associations, and yeah, it was serious.
Yeah, so I think it's really important that we not just see the examples that the individuals tell us about in the inscriptions, which we have a number of examples from bakers and from textile workers, and again from the coloni that are petitioning, but we also have a lot of legislation that we have to work backwards from and say, why was this legislation passed? Right? Like, why did they disband these collegia? Like, why do they keep seeming to get so upset? Like, there's a letter, very famous letter, that Pliny writes to Trajan in the beginning of the 2nd century, and Pliny is like, hey, I'm out here in Pontus Bithynia, and I really need a fire brigade out here. And Trajan, can I have a fire brigade, which is essentially a collegium of fabri? And Trajan writes back and he's like, they're troublemakers. I don't want you to have this collegium of Fabri. I don't want you to have these firefighters because they turn into a militia sometimes, that they turn into rabble rousers and resistors. And so I don't think that you should have them out there in Pontus Bithynia. And he's like, but we have a lot of fires going on. And I kid you not, Trajan goes, give them buckets with water.
Yeah.
So, Trajan, even in the outlying provinces, not just within Rome, Trajan is like, I don't want a lot of new collegia being formed because collegia, again, they're the underlying infrastructure for resistance. And Trajan knows that. And all emperors, all people in power, whether they say so or not, there's an underlying fear of how organization works. And grassroots organization has to come from somewhere. And oftentimes, if we're talking about Life of Brian is the best example of this, that the People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front are both collegia. Both of them are collegia. And it takes them joining together, getting over the fact that they have hated each other their whole lives. They have to join together for the
Splitters.
resistance. Yeah, splitters. The Jewish wars, for instance, even though, yes, the Jewish wars later on are not successful, but it's about so many political factions and groups coming together collectively to resist Rome. And so, again, just like Spartacus, they are not successful, but there is an underlying organization of labor and resistance that emperors know it doesn't come from nothing. It's not ex nihilo, you know?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I remember when I was debating Graham Hancock on Joe Rogan, and I ended with the collapse of societies, and I was like, look, elites are dependent on societies for their status and their power, but they're also obviously fearful of people who might organize effectively and withdraw labor or riot or whatever. And so, there's this constant tension, I suppose,
Yeah.
between ordinary people and the people that draw their power and status from all the work of us ordinary people.
I mean, they're extracting a resource from us. I mean, their power essentially comes from what we give them, and I think that we have to keep that in mind. That we have a lot more collectively. E pluribus unum is there for a reason. We are one out of many, and so we would benefit, I think, greatly from remembering the collective power that we hold together and having small things that we get upset about, or small differences. I totally understand, but that I think that is possible to overcome things because the power of us is much more powerful than the power of I.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah, and
know
I
that
think
sounds really idealist. I know that sounds really earnest and like, oh, she's just a professor that doesn't really. But I truly, I truly just do believe that we have to have a little bit more faith in our ability to come together as a group of people.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, especially in the Roman Empire, you see the power of, for example, the really basic necessities like food, you
Yeah.
know? And so, you have some examples of sort of bakers and especially in the late empire, there's this story I always love to tell. Here, wait, your slide reminded me of this. The compulsory union of bakers where being a baker would have sucked because you
Yeah.
basically have to grind grain, and grinding grain is a terrible, terrible job. It's a lot of hard backbreaking work. And so they would force people to become bakers. And like, I think there's some story, I'm trying to remember where they got some guy drunk and then he woke up the next day and he was a baker,
They
like down.
imprisoned him. They imprisoned him
Yeah.
underneath the bakery. Yeah,
Yeah.
bakery prisons are a very common allegation in the 4th century, especially because enslaved persons are within the bakery because it's so hot and you have donkeys down there that are milling. And so the donkeys are, it's very hot down there, and you don't have a lot of clothing on and you're enslaved and you can't get out. It's a subfloor. I mean, it's underneath the floor. And so, yeah, it would be a terrible imprisoned world because many times prisoners who are convicted criminals get sent to bakeries in late antiquity. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's not, but yeah, compulsory trades are one way that Romans try and secure the supply chain. And so when there's anxiety over collegia and what we might say are privately held collegia, the what we might say is more federalizing of these collegia, of bringing them into the state governance called the corporati system, increasingly happens, and you get more and more people that are very important to the Roman government being brought in as compulsory castes. And so you have artisans and craftspeople who previously had been allowed to have their own private collegia more and more being enrolled in public ones that are overseen by the government.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think in many ways, what we get is this biased picture coming from the emperors, the lawmakers, etc. And I remember, one of the key things that people need to remember is when a law or a decree is there, it's there because people are oftentimes doing the opposite thing. So,
Yeah.
it's a good way to be clever about reading history. You see a decree like this, bakers should not meet. They're saying that because bakers are meeting and actually having an impact.
Right. You got to read against the grain, and that is a
Yeah.
purposeful pun because they are
Yeah.
bakers.
It's a
But
purposeful fun.
I mean, the bakers are very important people, the pastores, and Ephesus is a place that has a lot of upheaval because Ephesus, as I say in the book, is the Pittsburgh, I believe, of the ancient world. They have a lot of unions of people that are very powerful. But I also think it's really important to see that when we begin to review the ancient world as labor upheavals rather than a whole bunch of mob violence, that we begin to see that people, individuals, are capable of agency, but they're also capable of creating group organizations and forethought, and also creating plans that are
Mhm.
not in the pejorative, the way that we normally speak about mob violence, right? Because whenever we talk about violence in that manner, it tends to be, oh, this is haphazard criminals that have no core objective and they're illegitimate, right? And so if we see that these are individuals that have plans, and that they have legitimate demands, that they are using their labor in order to further their own contract negotiations and capabilities and to improve the environment that they work in, I think that we have a lot more empathy for them than the sources give us that are super elite, and they're just calling them, oh, just mob violence, right? That's an easy way to say it. So like the most famous example of this that we see is the Nika riots. So I have an example of this. So on 33, you can see the Hippodrome in Constantinople. But this is probably the most famous example of a way that we can kind of revise the way that we see violence in the ancient world to kind of see it through the the lens of labor organization. Is that these factions, which sometimes can have thousands and thousands of people, these charioteer factions, the blues, the greens, and the reds, and the whites, they are leaders of workers. These charioteers are workers themselves, but they also have veterinarians, they have dancers, they have pantomimes, they have chorus workers, they have bear trainers, they have all of these entertainers, and they have fans that follow after the factions as well. But in the Nika riots, they have an arrest of a number of different people, and then the killing of a number of various members. And the blues and the greens come out and ask, after there is a botched killing of two of them aren't actually killed, and they ask for these individuals back to the factions, and Justinian and Theodora, who are the emperor and empress at the time, refuse to give back these two members. And so they stop having races in the hippodrome. And that's not what Procopius focuses on. But if we look at the calendar of races says every 5 days or so you have a hippodrome, and a hippodrome race in the circus, or in the circus in the west and the hippodrome in the east. And so if there are no races going on, they're withholding their labor. Okay, they
Yeah.
are not racing, they are not participating, and
It would be
they're
like if all of our sports teams just said, we're done right now. No more sports, and I've
Well,
seen people,
it's
yeah.
like Tom Glavine. I mean, do we not remember the great baseball strike of the 1990s and Tom Glavine of the Atlanta Braves leading the MLB strike? I mean, people roundly hated him. People threw things at Tom Glavine.
I mean, I'm a
People
Phillies
hated
fan, so I
him.
hated him anyway.
Well, I am an Atlanta Braves fan, and I have to disagree, and I hate John Kruk, so I'm not going to get into that with you. I'm not going to debate that, but I supported the baseball strike, but they truly hated him because they canceled the World Series that year. And so, yes, fans get upset, people get heated, there was violence in the streets with the Nika riots. But then Theodora and Justinian called them into the Hippodrome, right? Thousands and thousands of the blues and greens, 30,000, we think, lock them inside of the Hippodrome. And Justinian and Theodora, they think that they are very crafty here, but the factions think that they're at a collective action meeting, that they're at a bargaining meeting in order to renegotiate what's going on and to get the members of the Blues and Greens back after 10 days of rioting. What happens? Well, all of the doors are locked and all of them are slaughtered.
Yeah.
Thousands of them during the Nika riots. But again, just like Spartacus, okay, it was not successful. But if we kind of begin to think about what the objectives were and the fact that most of the charioteers are either enslaved or freed persons, then we can begin to see labor in a new way and to give much more credit to the workers in the ancient world than perhaps we have before.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, that's where reading against the grain, as you mentioned, it's not only for the bakers, it's in general. I think we need to
Yeah.
be very careful of how we read our sources because they reflect a very specific point of view. And hidden in there, we can start to find these kind of trends, if you see what I mean, that are there that show the power of ordinary people to work collectively, in a sense. So, okay, what do you think we can learn about this in today's world?
Well, I think it's probably not a shock to people that in the conclusion I talk about the fact that I think that unions and collective action, that we are, at least when I finished this book, that we were at the very beginning of a second wave of unionization and a second labor movement that was the biggest wave of unionization in the United States and really worldwide that we had seen since the 1950s. And I very much would encourage that this labor movement continue because I think the treatment of workers is decreasing, all while inequality is increasing. And that tends to be, as Walter Scheidel and many other people have spoken about, as inequality in the Gini coefficient goes up, violence also increases. And
Hmm.
so I think one thing that is very important is coming together in unions and community and banding together to see that that is one of the best ways to lower inequality rather than violence, rather than participating in warfare, participating in things wherein people are hurt, wherein people are going to be injured. I'm a nonviolent person. I'm a pacifist very much, and so I would prefer that inequality be brought down through unionization rather than through warfare. But as we are seeing it creep up, and the number of billionaires get more and more wealth that is concentrated at the very small 1% of society, we are going to see that this world is very much that we're going to come to a breaking point. And so I think that there will be choices to be made, and I hope that that choice is to unionize rather than to hurt people. So I
Yeah.
think that's probably my biggest takeaway is that um, we still have routes that we can take that are not going to be the way that will hurt others.
And I think another key thing we brought up is to be careful of the messaging. For
Yeah.
example, sometimes terms like mob violence are actually hiding a whole lot of nonviolence that the majority of people have.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of really pejorative rhetoric, and you can see it on a lot of newscasts. You can see a lot of things like this, but being very careful with the way that we speak about groups of people because we can make a lot of totalizing rhetoric that can be extremely negative.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's end with some questions. If people have some
Sure.
questions, I my patrons sent a question,
Oh, sure.
so let's get that up here. Was the organization of craft and trade the same in the whole empire, or were there differences between the Roman mainland and the later conquered parts of Europe, Near East, and Africa?
Well, every part is very different depending on where there are resources, but certainly North Africa has a high concentration of agricultural areas. It's one of the breadbaskets of the Roman Empire. And so, if you think of Augustine, for instance, Augustine is from Hippo in that general area. A lot of the agricultural estates of very wealthy Romans in the late Roman Empire are in this area of North Africa. And so that is really a high concentration of agriculture there, but also villas and mosaics and things like this. And so a lot of the craftspeople that we have in North Africa are very good mosaicists and artisans
Huh.
because there's an abundance of wealth and villas. Every time you have a villa economy, like you do in places like Pompeii or in southern Iberian Peninsula, you have a lot of artisans who are showing up like, hey, can I do a mosaic in your triclinium? And you have this in areas like what is modern day Jordan, as well as in what is modern day Israel, Palestine, as well as anytime you have abundance of wealth, you're going to have what we might call fine artists as well. So Italy has a lot of these and things like this. So it depends on what type of taste you have. But when you have high levels of wealth, there are also luxury products. So within the Italic Peninsula, you have the highest number of slaves. You have the highest number of enslaved people. Probably between 25 and 30% are
Wow.
are are enslaved persons. So you have to also think about status as well as the artisans themselves. And so, yeah, we have a very diverse group of people across the entirety of the Mediterranean, but um, we have workshops that cover the entirety of the Mediterranean. It just depends. You're going to have more brewers of beer in areas like Britannia and northern Germany. Along the Rhine River, there are tons of brewers called cervesarii because they like beer. Guess what? And then you're going to have more vinarii, that is winemakers, that are in southern France into the area of Greece and Italy. So it's all dependent on consumption patterns, but also on wealth patterns. But yeah, it's all different depending on the resources and depending on the demand and supply.
Okay, yeah, I think that makes a lot
Mm.
of sense because it's such a huge space. You're going to have so many different environmental and social
So many
factors in that
different.
way. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
it's
okay,
so different. Yeah, and depending on if you have things like wood, if you have things like marble, all of that is dependent on the types of artisans that you will have.
yeah, that makes sense. So we have a question from the chat from Meat Eater. What kind of job or trades that were considered good paying for the common Roman?
Yeah, the price edict of Diocletian is probably the best evidence we have for some of the best paying jobs. And um, high paying merchants, if you are a high level business person, then you do make a very high income. So this is what we might call white collar workers for the ancient world because they aren't actually doing the manual labor, but they're moving things around along the Silk Roads, along various trade areas. They own large ships. They're engaging in a lot of large scale trade because they own the ships. So there are people called naviculari, and these ship owners are shipping across the Mediterranean and they have contracts with Rome, kind of like defense contracts, but also supply contracts for the federal government, basically. And so, yeah, naviculari make a lot of money by shipping things for the Roman government. And as far as artisans day to day, cameo workers, very if you are a high level cameo worker, we know that Augustus paid a lot of money to a specific one because they make signature cameos that you specifically need just to imprint on your letters, for instance, right? Because when you pour the wax, you want to have your signet ring and you have a specific signet that you put on the letter. And so if you have high level craftspeople like that, also people who sell silk that have purple on it, the most expensive dye in the ancient world by
Yeah.
far, the most expensive thing in the ancient world, made in the Roman Empire, is silk dyed in Tyrian purple. That's the most expensive thing in the price edict of Diocletian. It's 100,000 denarii. And that's as much as a lion. Okay? That's a lion. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's a lot
Okay.
of snails to make
So,
that. So, you know.
yeah, it's a lot of snails, but also, so the last one I'll say is exotic animal dealer. Yeah, to the amphitheater. The people who go and get giraffes, lions, it's a very high risk, but high reward. Yeah.
They like your amphitheater.
Well, thank you.
All right, one last question. Oh, we have people saying that they want to buy your book.
Oh, thank you.
Like,
I'll just put
so,
thank you. This is the book. It's with Yale University Press, but I think it's like $22. I don't like Amazon, so I won't say to buy it on Amazon. I don't like Jeff Bezos, and like, you know, fuck you. But like on bookshop.org, I do. They are an independent bookshop, and you can buy it from them, or you can buy it directly from Yale University Press, which is a little bit better. So
yeah. And then last question, another one from Meat Eater. Do the Roman elites have their own hired goons to control and suppress workers?
yes, they do. This is the thing about workers, is that just because you are yourself a worker doesn't mean that you always defend them. The three best people to hire as hired goons, and bishops do this in late antiquity, but also politicians. Very famously, Caesar does it. Caesar instrumentalizes and uses as a militia his own gladiatorial familiae. Okay, so number one, gladiatorial familia fight in the amphitheater for you, but they also serve as your private militia to kill people for you. And Clodius and Milo are the best examples of this as well. In the late Republic, everybody has their own private gladiatorial troop to kill each other, right? And Milo and Clodius just hire gladiatorial troops that meet on the Via Appia to kill each other, basically. So you have a gladiatorial troop. Second group of people you always want to have: funeral workers. They're very buff, okay? They're constantly hitting things with pickaxes, okay? They work in the catacombs. They are very buff. They lift a shovel. And as a former archaeologist, I used to be buff, guys, okay? So you always want to have a fossor or a libitinarius as somebody backing you up. And so we have numerous 4th century bishops who use catacomb workers to kill other people with roof tiles and with picks. Okay, roof tiles, great way to kill people in the ancient world, by the way. And then the third group are charioteers, like charioteers as well. If you are lower level enslaved persons, or persons that are dependent on patrons through money, you are able to be coerced and manipulated and bought. And that hasn't changed today, in terms of, if people can buy you off and you are financially dependent on somebody, then you oftentimes are instrumentalized as muscle. And that is extremely upsetting and sad even today. But that is the name of the game in the ancient world. Gladiators, charioteers, funeral workers, top 3 workers used as bodyguards.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. That was a good question to end on. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
It was a pleasure. And thank you, Dr. Bond.
Yeah.
Sarah Bond.
That's me. That's me.
And you have the golden gun to kill with.
Well, I mean, Goldfinger is my favorite because it explains a lot about the financial market at the moment. So
there we go. All right. See you all later. Check out my Pompeii video out, I think tomorrow, but if we can't get it done, Sunday. See you all.